Martin Luther King was in favor of labor unions. He was opposed to the war in Vietnam and considered capitalism a primary problem for race equality in the United States. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Kelly Harris from Chicago State University joins me in examining King's legacy and how it has been reconstructed to one of a patient pastor interested in peaceful and civil discourse, removing him from any larger commentary on the world in which we live. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz, and I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Kelly Harris from Chicago State University. We'll be discussing Martin Luther King's legacy and the sanitation of King's work. So, welcome, Dr. Harris.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Viewers should know that you are the interim dean for the Honors College at Chicago State, and you're an associate professor of African American Studies.
Yes.
Deal with Black studies, Black political thought.
That's right. That's right.
Your most recent publication is number 45 in the Persistence of White Nationalism, which appears in a book, Not Our President.
That's correct. Yeah. A lot of people, Elizabeth Warren is in that book as well.
Okay.
A lot of, Mumia Abu-Jamal's in that book as well, so I was honored to be able to write
very good.
book.
And it's published by?
Third World Press.
Oh, very good.
Yes.
Okay.
Hakeem Abudi.
Well, we could talk about many things. You're on the Chicago Council for Black Studies and some other publications, but as we said at the beginning, we'd like to talk a bit about Martin Luther King and his legacy and how he appears in American public, I guess I would say.
Yes.
So maybe just give me some background on what attracts you to that and why that becomes a key.
Well, you know, it's interesting for me that as a young person, my father had been in the Nation of Islam for a brief moment. He also was a Black Panther Party member. And I remember him looking at a picture of Malcolm X and Dr. King. Well, two different pictures. Oh, that's
a famous picture.
Yeah, right? And he looked at Malcolm's picture and he took his glasses off and said, I will follow him anywhere. And then he looked at Dr. King, put his glasses back on and said, I wouldn't follow him across the street. And I thought it was funny, you know, at the time. And for a lot of people with Black power sensibilities, Dr. King was seen as soft and somebody who wasn't radical enough. But as I got older and started reading more and more Dr. King and learning about his speeches, beyond I Have a Dream, behind the letter from a Birmingham jail, behind even not in totality, I've been to the mountaintop, his last speech, when I started really looking into his speeches and listening to other researchers talk about Dr. King, there was a respect I gained for him, and I understood really how radical and revolutionary he was, even though he was still committed to nonviolence. I
would say that when I see Martin Luther King Day celebrations, it seems to be the thing that universities will present or cities will present as nonviolence. He loved your neighbor.
That's right.
Right? This is the message we want to give. But something you said there kind of struck me because when I understand Malcolm X, his history, which went through the Nation of Islam and became a major spokesperson, and that was his kind of a public persona. But when he was pushed out of the nation and he goes to Mecca and comes back and tours Africa, he evolved in his perspective. And I'm saying that because I understand King did as well from early on, where it was primarily around civil rights. He extended it to the war in Vietnam. He extended it to a critique of capitalism. And that's not what we mostly hear.
Well, you know, it's interesting too. So right after the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King the following year went to Ghana, and he was there for the celebration of independence with Kwame Nkrumah and people, you know, and there was a lot of radical people there. But Dr. King was there. He was invited. He was a part of that. And we have pictures from that, and we know about him being there because the CIA was spying on him already, right? But he also, too, you find at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 1960s, he had these speeches about labor. Matter of fact, there's a book about it called All Labor Has Dignity. And it's a string of King speeches going back to 1957, 58 about the labor movement. And you see the little kernels of his critique of capitalism there already. But it's not something that was really pushed because of the movement and the focus on the movement in terms of desegregation.
And I guess it's difficult to understand how much things were him strategic or even tactical, like how do I make a rhetorical appeal not just to the black community but to who might be allies?
That's correct.
And then also how I might appeal to what you might consider those with the power. So
That's correct.
He kind of adjusted his rhetoric. The problem with that is that it's almost like reading a scripture. You can take the parts you want and present this, right?
That's
I don't
true.
judge a man by his color, but by the content of his
character. That's
which, right. I mean, white racists love to use that
That's right.
because it
That's
says there should be no affirmative action. So
that's right. Yeah. I even saw just during the King celebration that the Trump administration pulled out a quote of Dr. King to justify putting up a border, putting up a fence and put up a wall. So, and they took it clearly out of context. And so you can cherry pick just about anybody and use it for what you want to.
So how do you understand the current, the popular legacy? In the black community, I would argue, but certainly more in the larger culture, that he's brought out as the proper way to have disagreements.
I think that I think you said it perfectly, he's been sanitized. I don't think most people have listened to most of his speeches or read any of his writings. I think that people have frozen him in 1963.
Yeah, the March on Washington,
that's
we
right.
get that speech,
That's
I have
right.
a dream, and that's it.
That's right. Yeah. And don't even listen to even the whole speech. We only get sound bites from some of those speeches. And I think it does Dr. King a disservice. I did a presentation on King Holiday about Dr. King, and there's a quote, a poem that I cite. But the poem is just beautiful because it captures exactly what I think's happened to Dr. King. And the poem says, "Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory, sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images that we would fashion for their lives. Now that he is safely dead, we must teach our children that he was a great man, even though we know that the cause that he fought for is still a cause, and the dream that he died for is still a dream, a dead man's dream." Now, I love that poem because we've built monuments to Dr. King, even when I don't think he would want to, because Dr. King was never about, the attention in that way and money or fun, things of that way. And it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to build the monument in D.C. I don't think he would be for that. And I think that he would want us to really grapple with his message in terms of the triple evils of America that America was facing, of racism, militarism, materialism, which leads to poverty. So I think he would want us to deal with those messages, and we're not doing it.
It's interesting that King is, now we have a King holiday. The history is not quite as sanguine as people would like to think, that, he died and then we have a holiday to celebrate him,
Right.
but it took many, many years. I'm not sure how long exactly. Arizona just recently made it a
That's right.
holiday.
Yeah, they
It's
were
just the last ones. But
Yeah.
the idea that he's presented is not just the presentation of him, but I wonder if it's also the presentation of the whole civil rights movement, because I mean, recently I saw the statistics of segregation in Chicago. I mean, King tried to march in Marquette.
That's right.
Marquette Park, and he was like stoned out of the place.
That's
But
right.
now we've got we're all one now. Everything's fine, but schools are more segregated than they were, and I'm assuming housing is just as segregated as it was. But we have a Martin Luther King Day, so
That's right. It's still bad, and we have all these King streets, in every major city. But I think when we really look at it, more than 1 in 2 black children in Chicago live in poverty. Over 75% of the Chicago public school system, the students in the school system are in poverty. So it's still a significant issue. As a matter of fact, a statistic just came out recently where I think the 26 richest people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 3.8 billion.
yeah,
Something
than
like
half of the rest of the population.
It's unbelievable.
Yep.
It's unbelievable.
Yep.
So it's gotten worse. The things that he looked at have gotten even worse, and that's something that we really need to confront.
Well, the kind of the narrative or the conclusion is, well, we had the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King showed us how we should be civil in our objection. It takes time, which is, he's also an evidence that it takes time, but ultimately that you win. But you get to the point now where we have Ferguson or we have Laquan McDonald or we have others, and there is not widespread support for Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Right? There's not widespread support for, although I would argue there probably aren't sufficient protests, but there isn't widespread support for those protests. So
that's right.
What could Black Lives Matter learn from the civil rights movement and SNCC and SCLC and what they were able to accomplish versus what Black Lives Matter now? My own critique would be they're largely a network. It's an online network.
It's not a
and they're
movement,
complete,
really.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah, it's not a movement. I think you could appreciate this, that, you know, when you were in Detroit at Wayne State and you saw the activism that was happening at that moment, the civil rights movement was so broad and there were so many different people involved in it. People who don't
Republic of New Africa, you had Black Panthers, you had the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, Black Workers Congress.
That's right, that's right. People who, when we teach, a lot of schools don't teach about. You know, so we still teach this, you know, unfortunately, this great man theory of Malcolm and Martin and these great leaders, and people think, well, we need another leader like that. So we really have to show people that there were so many people involved in the movement, unheralded, and those are the really important things. And it's not being in front of the camera, it's not being in front of the mic. A lot of the grunt work has to be done, is really the important work that goes into a movement, whether it's writing, organizing, or doing whatever.
Well, some of that I would say kind of permeates the response to police shootings as opposed to a movement.
Yeah.
It seems to be focused on find that cop and prosecute that particular cop, which seems a righteous thing and a just thing to do. But I mean, even if you do that, like was it Michael Brown that just, that doesn't mean there isn't going to be somebody else shot next weekend. I mean, how long do you keep doing it? And it seemed that King, well, as part of a movement, not just talking about King himself, but as part of a movement, it was more broadly conceived and such that at the end, King's saying we have to change the socioeconomic world, which is, I understand that's why he's in Memphis, not primarily for a civil rights question, but for the sanitation workers.
That's right. And you know, the last speech he had planned that Sunday to give a sermon, his sermon was going to be titled "Why America May Go to Hell," which is, you know, people are just shocked, you know, that he would say something like that. But he was saying that America had enough resources to eradicate poverty, to make sure that everybody had good housing, to make sure everybody had a working wage, livable wage. He was saying that back in 1968. And he said the fact that we don't use these resources to help all people means that we're going to hell. And I think that's a powerful message that we have to really wrap our minds around in terms of understanding who Dr. King was, because even that message got him marginalized from his civil rights colleagues who wanted to focus on voting and not focus on structural issues.
Well, that would be the next thing I want to kind of poke at. You have a civil rights movement in the 60s into the 70s, but it seems like, well, the Democratic Party in particular, but to some extent the entire institutional structures of politics.
Yeah.
We now have 4,500 black elected officials,
Right.
and no civil rights movement.
Right.
So the question is, where's the progress here, right? You may have a black mayor like, you know, Harold Washington or Coleman Young, or the black mayor when Rodney King was beat, which
Symbolic.
but many see it as more than, I mean, many see it as actually an instance of power because you have the Congressional Black Caucus and now we have a voice.
Yeah.
And I guess the question is, what's that calculus? Where you, the appearance is, well, now we can register to vote, now we can vote, and we've actually got people in Congress or in the Senate. We had a black president. We've arrived. I mean, I get the enthusiasm, but the question is,
I think people don't understand power, and as a political scientist, one thing that we know is that voting is the weakest form of political participation.
most political scientists won't say that.
But
I'm just telling you.
But that's the truth. I mean, it is. Voting is the weakest form of political participation. There are other things that are more important and more effective. And I think those things we use when we look at the movement, those things were being put to place. That's why the movements were effective, right? But once we got to voting, matter of fact, in political science, when we deal with things, we say there's a phrase called from protest to politics. So in 1965, Bayard Rustin wrote an article titled From Protest to Politics and said we have now exhausted the protest phase of our movement and we need to focus on electoral politics, electing these officials and those.
Well, electoral politics can be, I mean, I'm not opposed to electoral politics, but I'm opposed to electoral politics for the two parties that
Absent of
exist.
anything, that's right.
I mean, I've often thought of Ferguson, which was recent. I don't know the percentage of the population, but it's largely black. At which point do you simply say, rather than somebody flying in from Washington to give us support, or Al Sharpton or somebody from the Congressional Black Caucus say, we will form a political party here in Ferguson and we will elect our members to the city council, and the city council will simply fire all the cops that are shooting us.
Right.
I mean, when you're talking about direct political action, that's all within the legal system.
Right.
But it didn't rise to that. It only rose to the level of protest, and then I'm not sure of the actual events that it kind of dissipated, because it focused primarily on Michael Brown, not the larger question of stop and frisk and stop and ticket. And
I think those questions that you raised and those strategies were being raised, but I think it got hijacked, like a lot of movements do and a lot of activities do. Unfortunately, from people who want attention for their organization or for themselves, and it just steers things in a different direction. And it might be just elect me and I'll take care of everything and I'll get the representation we need. Unfortunately, that's, in 1972, there was a national black,
yes.
You remember that, right?
In Gary,
Indiana.
I was one of the only white people in the audience.
Were you really?
Yes.
Right. I can't believe it.
What are you doing here?
Right. Well, that was a high tide moment. That was a very watershed moment.
Yes.
But unfortunately, we didn't have the things that we thought that would come out of that. Because we could not bridge the differences between people who were Marxists and socialists or capitalists.
Right.
But we really need to go back and look at it and see what can we use from
the potential of that. I mean,
That's
even
right.
going back to Carl Stokes in Cleveland,
That's
I mean,
right.
he scared everybody because he ran as an independent and he was quickly kind of wooed. But
Yeah.
I wonder if part of it is also the changing, moving it, which includes race but kind of moves it beyond race, is the changing industrial structure of the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're talking about, I don't remember how many thousands of people were in the auto industry, and so you also had thousands of blacks in the auto industry, which is a position of power. So it's interesting to me that the civil rights movement happens when the equality of incomes between black and white was at the highest ever historically. Right? I mean,
true.
people don't simply respond to oppression or inequality, but there has to be some hope and some feeling of power.
That's right.
And if you're in the steelworkers union, the auto union, other unions, and you've got members,
to hold
and
on to,
so
right.
you're in a position of power. And it seemed like in the 70s, that was the beginning of the decline of manufacturing, because they're looking abroad to make more profits. So, again, what King was saying was that this can't be done in isolation, and it's kind of what Malcolm was saying. It can't be done just as a civil rights question, which doesn't remove the race. I'm not trying to remove the race from it, but it puts it in a context that helps explain how you can get a bunch of black politicians elected and don't have a civil rights movement.
Well, you said Malcolm was focused on human rights. And there was a historic meeting where Malcolm met, he didn't meet with Dr. King, but he met with his lawyer and his confidant, Clarence Jones, and at Sidney Poitier's house in New York. And a few other civil rights leaders were there. Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee were there. And Malcolm pitched the idea that he wanted to work with everybody on the human rights piece. Clarence Jones loved the idea. He went back and told Dr. King. Dr. King loved it.
How long was this before the assassination?
This was a few months before Malcolm was assassinated. Well, it was the summer before Malcolm was assassinated. And we know about that meeting because the FBI was listening in on the meeting. And they thought that that was the most threatening thing to come out of the meeting, that King and Malcolm would actually work together on a human rights campaign.
Yeah, raise it even outside the U.S.
That's right.
You're still raising the question of racism
and
civil rights, but you're raising it on the world stage, which
right.
at that period would be quite politically difficult for
during the
U.S.
Vietnam
abroad.
War, no question.
So did you get transcripts from the FBI? So when you're doing research, you
Well, I do pull them up. I do. The FBI are great historians.
That's
are
good.
great historians. There's an author who just wrote a book called FBI's, FBI's, and it talks about how they had been studying black literature and writers since the 1920s. And Claude McKay and Langston Hughes were one of the first ones they had, they were spying on. And they would literally break into their homes and get copies of what they were working on to try to get it before it went to the publisher, so they could be kept well aware of what was happening. But I want to circle back around on the Democratic piece and the union piece, because the Democratic Party, and this is something we still have to talk about, the Democratic Party really turned their back on unions when the 80s came around, and after Ronald Reagan won twice, we see the Democratic Party shift to the right. And really turn their back on unions, the women's student activists, and labor, I should say.
I just wonder if they, when they had that aura of the left, if it wasn't more like FDR said, the refuge of a conservative is liberalism, and I'm here to protect American industry by doing the nationalization. So. I mean, the left and right becomes a little bit elusive sometimes.
That's right. It does.
I mean,
it does.
It
has.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So, when you do African American studies at Chicago State or Black Studies, I think we used to have a Black Studies program here. But how does that fit into the larger question of history or politics or political science, so that it's almost siloed? People want to learn about Black history and the African Blood Brotherhood or Marcus Garvey over here, or women's history, women's studies will do the same kind of thing. How does that, not to counterpose that, but how does that not get compartmentalized so it should appear in?
Well, African American studies is interdisciplinary. So one of the things that we try to do, and we remind students and administrators, is that it's not just history. So we're trying to deal with psychology, sociology, economics, religion, art. We try to focus on all those things, because you can be a specialist in African American studies in any one of those areas. Yes. So my particular specialty is political science. One of my colleagues, hers is art and popular culture. So we try to let people understand it's a broad tent that includes all of those areas. Yeah. But every African American Studies department has its own focus too, its own focus. So for me, it would be focusing on politics and movements and things of that nature.
When you were talking about Detroit in the 70s or King and Malcolm meeting, those are not things that are widely understood. I mean, certainly in popular media and popular imagination, it doesn't exist, and I just wonder to what extent it occurs in political science classes or history classes.
Well, for mine it does.
At Chicago State University.
Yes, right. For mine it does, but I think for a lot of places it doesn't. So my primary thing is at Chicago State University is African American Studies, but I'm teaching a class this semester on Black protest movements, and you can best believe that I'm going to talk about drum, and I'm going to talk about the things that were happening in Detroit. Reverend Albert Cleage, and Malcolm X made one of his famous speeches there at his church, and James and Grace Lee Boggs were on stage with him. So I want to talk about that history, because these are names that students have no idea about, and they wouldn't even know it was important. But I don't think we can really grapple with the issues today or during that time if we don't talk about what was happening in Detroit and all the different actors and activists.
And it has to be a question of, again, talking about Black Lives Matter, it's like, how do you make the connection between other important inequalities or discrimination without losing focus on what you're interested in? I mean, I saw a thing on their site that has things on Palestinian rights, which I think is good, transgender rights, which I think is, but do people need to kind of check all these boxes before they can participate in movement, as opposed to bringing people in from their perspective? I know when I was in Detroit, there was anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and part of the security detail was the Panthers. So they didn't come because it was a march for Breakfast for Children or some other, ideological thing for themselves, but they came because they saw Vietnam as an issue that was particularly important to black youth. So, but the anti-war movement didn't present that you, first of all, have to support the Panthers to be at this demonstration.
Exactly.
But the Panthers had to be opposed to the war to be at the demonstration. So it's kind of, the intersectionality sometimes seems to interfere with unity. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And I think things have been really kind of reduced to sound bites and slogans.
Oh, yeah.
And not really in-depth understanding and focus on particular things.
Well, certainly the media scape that we live in with social media and stuff, it appears that we're having a conversation and we aren't necessarily having a conversation. So
That's correct.
We could talk for a while. We'll have to have you back. And,
please do.
Come visit some of our classes. But I think that's about all the time we have for today. I want to thank Dr. Kelly Harris for visiting us, and we'll see you next time.